In this video, we'll talk about two topics. First, we'll talk about the sources of monopoly, and then we'll talk about monopsony. Sources of monopoly. So how do you come to face a downward sloping demand curve? Well, there are basically two ways. You can be distinctive or you can be alone. We've talked a little bit about distinctiveness, differentiating your product. For the next few slides, I'd like to talk about various basically ways to be alone. So one way to be alone is for regulation or law to prevent others from competing with you. Some example of regulatory monopolies. Liquor retailing provides a couple of interesting examples. In the state of Pennsylvania, the only entity that's allowed to sell bottled liquor is the Pennsylvania Liquor Control Board. And their stores have all the kind of merchandising appeal of methadone clinics. There are about 600 such stores, but the pricing and so forth is controlled by a single entity, so that entity is a monopolist. Now, before we start snickering too much at Pennsylvania, we should realize that Minnesota has some liquor monopolies as well. In Minnesota, it's not the state, but rather it's municipalities that can, if they wish, run municipal liquor stores, which are in effect monopolists in the sale of bottled liquor inside of the town. So on the right-hand side here, we have a picture of one such monopoly municipal liquor store in Roseau. An important source of monopolies in contemporary market economies is patents. So patents, which have to be for novel and non-obvious innovations, allow their owners and inventors some 17 years or so of exclusive marketing rights. And so these are really the right to be a monopolist. You're the only guy who gets to sell this product. If other people copy it, they get in some trouble. This table shows a list of drug patents expiring in 2012. What tends to happen when a drug patent expires, if it's a patent for a drug that actually was marketed and for which there was significant demand, then there tends to be lots of generic entry and the price will fall substantially, illustrating again that monopolists tend to charge much higher prices than arise in competitive situations. Another source of monopolies are what are called natural monopolies. Now, because of IRS, which again is the increasing returns to scale, only one firm fits in a market. And so that often ends up as a monopoly, and it often ends up regulated. Just to remind ourselves what this looked like when we discussed it in a previous section, we had a market demand curve, and then we had an average cost curve that was declining over the entire relevant range. In this situation, only one firm will fit in the market, and this historically was the case for telephone. Back in the days when telephone was carried over copper lines that were either dug into the ground or strung on poles across the country, one firm could serve the market much more cheaply than multiple firms, and so it made sense for it to be a monopoly, and of course it ended up regulated. A similar kind of example was railroads. Imagine running more than one train between two cities or more than one sets of tracks and so forth. That doesn't make much sense from the standpoint of costs, and so we tended to have monopolies on particular routes which were regulated by the Interstate Commerce Commission. Part of the point of these archaic looking logos is to emphasize the last point on this slide, which is that technological change, which as we said in an earlier session changes optimal scale, can really change whether a particular industry would likely be monopolized by just one firm. Technological change has substantially changed transportation. Now in competition with trains, we have trucks, we have planes, and of course a lot of goods don't need to be physically shipped anymore either. In competition with landline telephones, we have many different technologies. We have cellular phones, we also have internet telephony. So one perspective is that if you just wait a few years or decades, that a lot of natural monopolies will cease to be natural monopolies. A third source of monopolies arise from what are known as network effects. And these occur when the desirability of using some product depends on the number of others who are also using the same product. When this happens, there's a tendency for markets to tip, meaning for the market to tip over to one particular product which ends up being dominant. There are a lot of interesting examples, and they vary in how literally the benefit accrues to you from how many others are using it. But let's talk about each of those. So eBay, that's a site where you can, if you're a buyer, you can go buy stuff from lots of different sellers, and if you're a seller, you can sell stuff to lots of different buyers, usually via an auction, although other mechanisms work too. The point here, the network aspect of eBay is that it's better for you as a buyer if there are more sellers there because there's more stuff you can choose from. And it's better for you as a seller if there are more buyers there because bringing your stuff there makes it more likely that you'll find a buyer. So there's a network effect in that sense. Amazon has kind of a different sort of network effect. At Amazon, part of the user experience has to do with using the information left there by other users, the reviews and so forth. So if you're using a service that no one else uses, there wouldn't be any user information there and it wouldn't be all that appealing. On the other hand, if you're using a service that many other people are using and where they're leaving reviews that are informative for you, that's going to make it a more appealing service. So in that sense, there are network effects at Amazon as well. Facebook provides maybe the most literal example of network effects on this list. Facebook is a lot more interesting for you to join if your friends are also connected. It literally is a network. And so in situations like this, it's quite common for markets to tip, and in fact, Facebook is just dominant in social networking almost everywhere. Although I guess it's an interesting illustration of the idea that markets can tip, that there's a different social networking website called vContact, which is probably not how they pronounce it in Cyrillic, but in any event, vContact, which is dominant in Russia, and Facebook is very distantly behind them. So that's a nice illustration of tipping. A market can tip one way or another. A last source of market power again, and now we're not talking about literal monopolies, but again, just about firms that have market power and downward sloping demand curves. And this we've mentioned earlier in the course, but we'll mention it again today. A way to have market power and to have a downward sloping demand curve is from being distinctive, from advertising, from being differentiated. These are various different activities that can give rise to market power. And a nice prominent example, contemporary example of this is certainly Apple's products. They're rather differentiated, they're distinctive, they advertise, and people really like them. And they have very high market shares in many categories of products, although not literally monopolies. Each of their products has some competition. All right, let's switch gears and talk about monopsony, or another name for this would be buyer power. Now, to understand this, let's think about the alternative. When there's a small buyer, the buyer can buy all that he or she wants without driving up input prices. A small buyer, just like a small seller, is a price taker in a market. A small buyer is a price taker, could buy however much he or she wants without driving up the price. But for a large buyer, the quantity choices it makes, that is how much it chooses to purchase, is going to move it along the supply curve. The most extreme version of this is literally monopsony, a market with only one buyer. And the question we want to think about to understand behavior in these circumstances is the following. How does the expenditure on inputs change as the amount purchased increases? So to get our bearing, let's make a comparison between stuff we've seen up above, having to do with sellers, and the stuff we're now talking about. So again, a small seller was a price taker. A small competitive seller was a price taker. No matter how much it sold, it had no effect on the price. So its demand curve was just horizontal. Whereas a large seller, even in a homogeneous goods industry, the more it sells, well, it's big relative to the market. So if it were to sell this amount, it would get that price. But if it would choose to sell that price, that amount instead, it would reduce the price down to here. The only way to clear the market, I should say, would be to reduce the price down to there. We have an analogous kind of story for buyers. But now we're thinking about the supply curve they face, not the demand curve. So imagine you're a small buyer, and you're choosing how much of this item should I buy. I could buy this amount, in which case I'd pay this price. Or I could buy a bunch more. Let's say I could more than double the amount I'm purchasing, in which case, well, I'd face the same price because, well, by assumption I'm small, the amount I buy has no effect on the price. Contrast that with me being big relative to the market. In that situation, if I buy a little bit, that's the price I pay per unit. But if I want to buy a bunch more, I'm going to pay a higher price. Not just a higher price because I'm buying more units, but a higher price per unit because I'm buying more units. So the average price I pay per unit if I buy a few units is here. The average price I pay per unit if I buy a lot of units is way up here. To drive this point home, consider two quantities in this diagram, quantity 1 and quantity 2. And as Q rises, the quantity I purchase, as that rises, expenditure rises for two different reasons. First, buying more Q and second, price per unit rises. And as a result, the marginal expenditure is above the price. To see this, imagine that I bought Q1 units. To see this, imagine that I bought Q1 units. I'd pay P1, and so I'd pay this total rectangle as expenditure on this input. Now imagine I go over, I change, and instead I want to buy Q2 units. Now, if I could continue paying those units that To see the impact of the quantity choice on expenditure really clearly, let's take a look at this diagram. So let's think about two hypothetical quantities of input that I'd want to purchase. One hypothetical case is that I want to purchase Q1. If I wanted to purchase Q1, then I'd have to pay a price of P1 per unit, and I'd have to basically expend this whole rectangle as my expenditure. If alternatively I wanted to buy Q2 though, I can't just pay the same price and buy a few more units. So I can't just extend this rectangle out this way. Instead, because I'm going to have to pay a higher price per unit on every unit that I purchase, I'm going to have to extend the rectangle all the way out to here. Another way to say this is that as Q rises, expenditure rises for two reasons. One is that I'm buying more Q, and let's think about that as extending this rectangle out this way. But the other is the price per unit rises, which is what extends the rectangle up this way as well. And so what that means is that the marginal expenditure is above the price. Or to think about it this way, as I add quantity, the extra expenditure per extra quantity isn't just some fixed price, but it's something bigger than the price. This should seem a little bit familiar because it's a lot like, in fact it's very completely analogous to the idea that marginal revenue is below the demand curve for a downward sloping demand curve. Here, marginal expenditure is above the supply curve for an upward sloping supply curve. Alright, let's do this a little bit more systematically. So expenditure is P of Q times Q. If there's a linear supply curve, then the price I pay for this input is P equals A plus B times Q. That means overall expenditure is P of Q times Q, or AQ plus BQ squared. Marginal expenditure, which is the change in expenditure with a change in quantity, or if you were a calculus buff, it would be DE, DQ. Well, this is going to be very analogous to what we do with a linear demand curve to find marginal revenue. So the analogy to bisecting a linear demand curve is the following. Marginal expenditure is going to have the same intercept as the supply curve, but twice the slope. So here's a picture. We've got a demand curve, which is also here depicting the marginal valuation that this firm attaches to inputs, we have a supply curve, which frankly also tells us the average expenditure, because any quantity we choose along it, that's a price, that's the average expenditure per unit that we buy. And then finally we have the marginal expenditure curve. And notice that it has the same intercept on the price axis, but it has twice the slope. Now, what does the firm do? Well, if the firm weren't large relative to the market, then the intersection that we would see, the equilibrium, would be right here. That would be the quantity, and that would be the price. And that would be the price. But instead, this firm compares the benefit of an additional unit to the actual cost of another unit. The benefit of an additional unit is along its demand curve. But the cost of an additional unit isn't on the supply curve. Instead, it's on the marginal expenditure curve. Because again, as it hires additional units, or as it buys additional units, it pays a higher price on each unit it buys. And so the intersection occurs right here. The quantity that a monopsonist purchases then is this QMS. Now the question is, what price do they pay? Well, they pay the price on the supply curve. So this is the price a monopsonist pays. Here's an example that may make this clear. Suppose your firm is the only employer in town. Let's say that your demand for labor is given by P equals 100 minus Q, where Q is the quantity of labor you'll hire. Labor supply is given by P equals 10 plus Q, and that means marginal expenditure is given by P equals 10 plus 2Q. The question is, what quantity of labor gets hired and at what price? So what we want to do is solve for the price that equates demand with the marginal expenditure. So this is demand over here, this is marginal expenditure over here. When we solve that, we get that 100 minus 10 equals 3Q, or that 90 equals 3Q, or Q equals 30. Let's get the price from the supply curve. Well, the supply curve was P equals 10 plus Q, 10 plus 30 equals 40. So the value of the last unit to buyers, though, is on the demand curve, and it's 70. You just plug into the demand curve 100 minus Q, and we get 70. That's very analogous to the markup. This is kind of a markdown of the price paid relative to what it's worth to the buyer, kind of analogous to a markup of what a seller charges for a unit relative to what it cost. Here's the picture. It's a lot like the picture we've seen earlier, except here we have the numbers, and so the quantity is 30. I should say that's a quantity that stems from the intersection of marginal expenditure with demand, so there's the optimal quantity. The price we get off the supply curve, and that's 40. All right, what are our takeaways? Well, on the sources of monopoly, there are really three broad sources of monopoly. One is regulatory or legal, and those are examples like municipal stores or patents. Second example is natural, which means only one firm fits into a market. Traditionally, those have ended up being regulated. A third is network effects. A lot of the interesting fortunes made recently arise from products that are better for consumers as more other people use them, and that can give rise to tipping over to one product, and that in turn gives rise to a lot of de facto monopolies. Of course, you can also get market power just from being distinctive, even short of just being literally a monopolist. A last point is that large buyers can have market power, analogous to the way that large sellers can have market power. the exercise of this monopsony power tends to depress quantities and depress prices.